Amy King here to put together a panel, and so I'm going to just walk away and Amy will tell you what's going on. Thanks.
Hi everybody, thanks for coming out today. Obviously this is the Race and Poetry panel since it's 3 o'clock. I'm just going to do a quick intro of everybody, read their bios very quickly, and then we have a few people who want to make some opening statements. To my right is Christopher Stackhouse. He's the author of the poetry collection Slip and co-author of Seismosis, which features a collaboration of his drawings with text by writer-author Professor John Keane. Next to him is Timothy Liu. He has 2 new books of poetry forthcoming, Bending the Mind Around the Dream's Blown Fuse and Polytheogamy, and he lives in Manhattan, which is, yes. We just had a different conversation about it. Anyway, next to him is Megan Punchy. Punchy? Yeah. I've only known her for several years. Megan Punchy is the author of Stratification, which just came out this year. She resides in New York City and has just completed her MFA in poetry from the New School. She's the curator of and host of Word of Mouth, a reading series I'll just sit on it. Dedicated to Word of Mouth curator and host, and she's also the managing editor for the literary journal Oranges and Sardines. Next to Megan is Mindy Lewis Obadike, and she's the author of Armor and Flesh, Poems in the Liberato for the Internet Opera, the Sour, I said Liberato, Libretto, the Sour Thunder. I like that. I'm trying to cut people's bios, but of course it's just not working. For the Internet Opera, the Sour Thunder, the Whitney Museum of American Art, Yale University, and the New York African Film Festival and Electronic Arts. I pulled this bio and obviously put a lot of stuff in here. I know she has a new kind of EP out called Document that she put together with her husband, her partner, both. Keith, who's here too. I just saw him. And next to her is Jennifer Firestone. Please be a short bio. Jennifer Firestone is the co-editor of Letters to Poets, Conversations about Poetics, Politics, and Community, which I've actually seen an early copy of, and it's really wonderful, and I highly recommend. Not that the other poets don't have great books too. It's forthcoming this month, next month in October, and a bunch of other stuff. Just Google her if you're interested. Matthias Svalina is co-editor of Octopus Books and Magazine, and he's the author of the chapbooks Why I Am White, Creation Myths, and The Viral Lease, and a bunch of other stuff. Just Google him. And I am Amy King, and you can just Google me. He sits behind you. Oh God! You know that's why. I was like, should I not be here? Tiza Bryant is. You can just see 1:15 p.m. if you want to know. I don't have a bio here because actually she has a wonderful book that she doesn't have in her hand. It's over there, and it's called Unexplained Presence. And it's she just read from it, and so I don't have her bio, but she's a great poet, and she's actually read in my series. So I read a bio for you once, so it's cool.
That was me yelling David Larson at the top of the stairs. Okay.
And yes, so we have a few people who are going to make some opening remarks. I'm trying to keep this short. I'll just sit here for a second. We'll go around the room. Matthias, you can start with your opening remarks.
All right. I started crossing out most of my opening remarks, actually, already. I think I'm here because of that chapbook, the Why I'm White chapbook. It's a long poem about thousands of people who are all me, who are all white. And what I'm interested right now is building an ethics of contemporary American surrealism, and to try and use a rationality and a lack of logic to understand ethics. And I'm going to just kind of poke through a couple of the things I have here that I haven't crossed out. These sort of been notes toward. Cultural hierarchy, of course, depends on the illusion of a stable center. And through this illusion, the privilege anointed to whites in America can seem appropriate, justified, normal. And as Eduardo Glissant, author of the Poetics of Relation, points out, this is the logic of the plantation. The stable center of American culture is anti-atavistic. There's a cultural resistance to recognitions of origins, and therefore an ongoing work of ignoring oppression. Conflicts of race and class are willfully ignored, and at the same time, violently contested. And at the same time, they're given a government-approved language of multicultural acceptance. And what I'm interested in is how experimental poetics, in any form, is a resistance to the center, a resistance to the norm. So from absurdism to process poetry to surrealism, any kind of poetry that is against the personal narrative. And I had this anecdote that happened this week that is a kind of banal moment of race being aware in life. I was at the Kinko's, and this woman had her bags spread out. Clearly someone lives in the streets. And two white guys came by, and they were sitting down to work, and one of them pushed her bags, and she started to yell. She got very angry. She said the cops have been treating her like shit. She said that, she said a lot of things. She said a lot of profanities. She moved from talking about her educational place and people's reaction to it to this kind of unspooling moment where she was yelling about how the cops are stealing her art out of her bags and becoming millionaires by selling her art. And then, of course, the cops showed up because they'd been called. And they grabbed her bags, which contained her art, and roughly escorted her out of the Kinko's. And at the same moment, I was photocopying for my students out of the Norton Anthology this section of Frederick Douglass's autobiography where he talks about learning to read. And later that day I thought if I was a personal narrative poet, I would go home and I would write a poem in which this became a display of American race from my white male perspective. And the moment of personal narrative there would transform this woman into a symbol of a woman, would make meaning out of the fact that I had Frederick Douglass's words in my hand at the moment this was going on, transforming Frederick Douglass into an idea of Frederick Douglass. And this all seemed to be the process of, through sympathy, through a liberal-leaning idealism, replicating the process of the cops walking in and pulling her away. That these people, who are people in interaction, in conflict in the world, would become symbolic. And as the center of a white male perspective, I would be able to hold the key to how they are metaphors. I could have written a better poem, maybe. No, I probably would. But there's a clear logic of how a personal narrative poem would arrive out of that. And that's the kind of way that I think my original title for this was Straight White Males Should Stop Writing Personal Narrative Poetries of Epiphanies. So I want experimental poetics to destabilize the myth of the center. And I want that myth decentered both by those who are oppressed by the functions of the stable center and those who gain cultural privilege from the stable center. And I think that this is a moment of recognizing irrationality, recognizing the surrealist logic of human interaction on a daily basis. That as much as we may understand, as much as we may look face to face, we're always creating metaphors and always creating illusions about each other. And I think that there's a strange tradition in 20th century at least, white experimental poetry, of applauding themselves for looking toward the other and creating a sense of difference. But from Eliot's and Ginsberg's seeking an Orientalist idea of transcendence to Pound's and Rothenberg's creation of appreciation anthologies, they always pull the other back to the white center. And it presumes that the center does not contain difference, that there's no other to the center. And what I love about the potential for a destabilized experimental poetics and thinking about race is that the center is always broken. The center is always shown to be a myth. And so it's one destabilized node speaking to another destabilized node. And there's not a lot of, when I look at white so-called experimental poets, there's not a lot of talking about race. And that, when I see that, it seems to me that they're writing all their poems with, you know, those old flesh-colored crayons, you know? But they don't have them anymore, but when I was growing up, that was the flesh color, you know? And I'm sure you remember that. And I always think that that's the ink color of poems that don't recognize race. bring stuff there.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just, as I was looking at the initial questions that Amy asked, I thought about this conversation between Thomas Jefferson Anderson Jr., Hale Smith, and Ollie Woodrow Wilson that happened in a conference in 1969 at Indiana University. And the conference was called Black Music and Our Culture. It was a conference about black music in the academy. And I think it's important to remember that it's 1969 because this was a kind of new enterprise, at least for a white university, but maybe for all American colleges. This was a panel on black composers in the avant-garde, and T.J. Anderson, who was also a poet, was asked a question about the influence of the black composer upon, quote, the more recent facets of composition. It's also important to note that some of these composers were working in electronic media, also very new for 1969. And his answer was this: when one thinks of the avant-garde, one immediately thinks of revolutionary composers, those with a new musical language, those who are involved with experimentation, or anything outside of the establishment. If we take this as a definition, and since we can already assume that all black composers have always been outside of the establishment, one logically reaches the conclusion that all black composers are avant-garde. I don't know if he would answer this question in the same way today, and I'm not sure what exactly was his intention in putting things in that way, but I realize that with someone who was making music that, even when I read this statement 30 years later, was making music that was really avant-garde. It was still new, was still challenging, was still offering new questions. I thought it was interesting that that was his answer, and I thought it was different from if he had made music that did not seem to challenge the boundaries. Another important moment in that conversation was when Ollie Wilson was asked what he would say to a person who professes to see no black musical elements in his techniques, aside from the obvious dedication and subject matter. And his answer was nothing. And I'm also interested in that response because I realize how little I know about whether that was, I have nothing to say because I'm angry about the question, or whether it was a matter of acceptance of people who were working in a different way. But I think both of these things are on my mind as we go through.
I'm just going to read some of what I wrote in response to the questions that you asked about race and poetry, which was a long series of questions, but I think those questions, people will hear the question in my response to some of the work. And I'll skip around the first paragraph of how I responded to Amy's solicitation to be on the panel. Race in poetry is a rather broad subject, as the so-called races are many, mixed, and variable depending on who is asked exactly what race is. Ostensibly, race as a subject nearly always collapses into the fundamental dichotomy of black and white, dark and light. I'm not particularly sure that it is fair to discuss race specifically so much outside of that paradigm. That is, the race problem is very specific to the West and Occidental creation. On the other hand, ethnic hierarchy and competition is a perennial, global, universal social problem, which really comes down to the basics of power, of who controls resources and to what end. These considerations go beyond sustenance after a certain point, and though a short few steps removed, aesthetics seem to be as much on the line as eating, clothing, and sheltering ourselves. And I guess with that paragraph, one of the underlying commentaries is the property of aesthetics as a kind of property, and how African Americans are excluded from certain provisions of the aesthetic normative, be it center, as Matthias mentioned, or as avant-garde, as on the perimeter, as what we're trying to discuss here with non-whites being included in that fray, which is a different center. And then I wrote Speaking about American culture in the United States is very difficult to discuss. It is very difficult to discuss our artistic development on the whole without discussing the role of Black Americans, as they are called. Our artistic history is riddled with points of avoiding or embracing the influence of the descendants of African chattel slaves and the people known as native to this land we call North America, well before many a paleface arrived on these shores. A more balanced take on our situation is one that clearly acknowledges America is not European, and though it is predominantly Anglophonic, it is not English. We have to realize that our poetry, vis-a-vis our culture, in order to be more inclusive, to become richer, in order to grow, has to understand that. It is also inexorably a non-white nation in which the fabrication of race is ultimately realized by the iterated conception of white privilege in all things social, governmental, artistic, academic, literary, etc. Whole cultures have been mitigated, if not decimated, in the name of achieving white privilege. It is interesting to discuss race and poetry, knowing that such a conversation tends to mitigate, if not eliminate, say the fact that to be Anglo-Saxon is to be a very specific ethnicity that is distinct from being Gaul or Irish or Nubian or Fulani or Ainu or Nordic or Slav or Semite. The enterprise of the West has been to normalize white privilege through various apparatuses upon which the false science of race provides much of the illusory background. And then say a few different things about, well, the next paragraph is, poetry has certainly played a role in the construction. Contemporary poetry plays its extended part by catering to the institutional divisions where values are set in a deep-seated belief in white superiority as the default space of the sublime nothingness upon to which so many Jewish, Italian, Japanese, South Asian, Russian, Black American, Irish, etc., aspire to prove that they are educated and contemporary. There are efforts to the contrary, of course, but more and more Americans write against the background of an academic and literary establishment that sees everything in relation to the great white expanse of a rather short few hundred years. This as opposed to writing in relation to the numerous combinations of peoples that continually change the cultural terrains of our world. Therein lies the salient problem, a willful ignorance toward the complexities of humankind that tends more to cast light on either or instead of both and. In this case, the professor in the classroom of the world has been conceptual white supremacy in a blindfold. And then I close the piece, skipping a large paragraph, to say the experimental or the avant-garde is by nature politically disruptive. It aims to educate, to change, to interrogate, to turn our heads away from, and conversely deeply into, the mind-numbing hum of the status quo and its blind violence. Therefore, experimental literatures, their respective standards notwithstanding, must be inclusive, at least in its considerations and studies, if not in any specific practice. Political correctness is for the guilty. It dulls our sensitivities to underlying racial, ethnic, political, sexual, social issues of our day. Within our poetics, as we formulate different types of experiments, we need direct eye contact with difference.
Yeah, that's some notes. Okay, I guess I'll just read it. Is there this kind of knee-jerk? I'm curious about why I'm here with several other poets who claim an identity other than, in addition to, white or whatever, because of my work. Recent writing on the uses of racialized imagery in European film because of my face. Did I, when I received Amy's invitation, feel compelled to accept? And in this, I'm responding to some of the kind of quotes from Reginald Shepard about writers of color and kind of like representing otherness on the one hand, and what Harriet Mullen was saying about what's happening in discursive spaces about other blackness versus black otherness. So I was responding to those kinds of things and like why I'm here. So how did I feel? Did I feel compelled to accept the invitation, conflicted, resigned? I said yes, and then I asked myself what I had to say, if I even really felt like it. I remembered San Francisco, where I lived for 8 years, and how this one poet, whose politics seemed in place, experimental poet, who whenever he saw me said, "Hey Renee," thinking I was Renee Gladman. "How are you?" Then, "Oh, sorry Giovanni," thinking I was Giovanni Singleton. But this is rather innocuous compared to the stealthy silence of white privilege that pervaded and still pervades the Bay Area poetry scene, community. In response to Harriet Mullen's suggestion that a discourse of other blackness rather than black otherness has begun moving into larger discussion vis-a-vis the work of certain poets, I wonder where is the work of poets engaged in a critical representation of whiteness besides Juliana Spar and present company. I'm glad to hear what you had to say because I feel like I'm here for you, like 7 of you, and to be out there listening in some way, right? Isn't there a flip side to white Euro-American identity? If so, I think, why am I here behind the table, or the imaginary panel table, instead of out there in the audience listening and learning within their discursive space, their cultural practice, day-to-day life experiences, as an other kind of white person, white poet? Can future gatherings make the shift from immediately calling on people of color to lead the discussions about race, especially right now, to the tail end of an especially racial, racist, and divisive presidential campaign? Yet, too, I have to talk about writing as an editor, about reading, about the Encyclopedia Project, which I'm one of 3 editors, and how fraught Volume 1 was, not just because perhaps writers of color didn't think the project was for them, but because I assumed that my 2 white co-editors read as widely and inclusively as I did. Simply reading writers of color regularly, organically, is an experiment of consciousness first. A new poll showed recently that 40% of registered Democrats harbor racist views. Surprised? I'm not. Nor am I surprised by the poetics list, the self-perpetuating whiteness of experimental poetry community, who curates, who publishes, who's left out, left to remedy, fix, aid, by starting colored-focused presses. And yet, there is again a conversation happening, begun by white people, about white privilege, an acknowledgement of a basic fact. And I go into some diatribe about, inheriting a systemically racist system and benefiting from it in any number of ways. And most of this is because I've received a forward of Tim Wise's, This Is Your Country on White Supremacy about 45 times. And recently, his follow-up, which is, understanding white supremacy for haters and people in denial or something like that. And so I guess my questions are about how we have these conversations, and in listening to everybody, I realized too that actually Giovanni Singleton and Renee Gladman held a symposium some years ago in the Bay that kind of asked these questions about experimental poetry and race with an all of color panel, about how experimental writing is actually determined within an African kind of diasporic literary tradition, like what is meant by avant-garde. And I wonder how that question kind of shifts and changes according to ideas of what's central and what Chris was saying about aesthetics. So I'll leave it there.
I have an opening statement that will go all over the place, and it will actually sort of address. David asked me last minute to throw a panel together, and this is actually a conversation that I've wanted to sort of have publicly for a long time, even though obviously the bases of it are going to be kind of all over the place, aesthetics versus actual community issues. But one thing I do know, that anytime you attach the word race to any kind of discussion like this, very often the glaring omission in the discussion and in the audience itself is a lack of Caucasians, white, whatever you want to call people of this skin tone. So I thought, who can talk about these issues? Who should talk about these issues? And you cut out a paragraph that I actually was going to say. I'll quote Christopher Stackhouse: "Political correctness is for the guilty." And I think that it's something that we sort of hide behind, and I think Matthias will have something to say about this in terms of what he's just talked about in terms of whiteness being a myth. So that said, I want to acknowledge that many of my questions, though I have been careful to be broad and referential, in them I may betray a middle-class white bias that Barbara Jane Reyes recently on her blog responded to in terms of the, I don't know if any of you have heard of the numbers trouble essay that people were working on in California. Actually, Juliana Spar and Stephanie Young. She responds to and asked to explain the feminist poetics of X community here, and just a little snippet. She writes, "I would ask that this American avant-garde reconsider that we of other communities may not group ourselves in the groupings set up for us by those who do not live in our communities. Consider that Filipino-American poets may have more historical and linguistic commonalities with Chicano and Latino poets. Consider that Filipino-American poets may have more aesthetic commonalities with African-American poets. Consider that Filipino-American poets may have more oral traditions, storytelling commonalities with Native American poets." So I wanted to allude to that just because of the aesthetics component of this discussion. But it's practically speaking, back to the sort of glaring omission of who gets to talk about this issue and how do you join it with poetics. Jennifer Firestone, in her response to the group online, she cites and I'll let you elaborate on this, her classroom, whenever she tries to get students to speak about race, there is a palpable silence among white people, and I'll let her explain how they respond when she does address them. So that's one side of the coin. There's a silence or a fear that white people aren't able to speak about race, as though we don't have a race. Matthias will also probably address this even further. And then on the other side of the coin, Tim Yu, on his blog, he wrote a lot about the poetics list, of which I am now the moderator of, and fumbling trying to get that thing to sort of become more, about discussion. Anyway, one of the things he had to say about why he left the list, I apologize for taking just a small thing out of it, but he says, "I have to say a few words about the particular ways in which Asians get talked about on this list, which I would argue has everything to do with the peculiar, at times even pathological relationship American poetry has with Asian culture. For the past 100 years and longer, Asian cultural influences have played a role in some of the most significant breakthroughs in American poetry, from Pound and Moore to Rex, Roth, Ginsberg, and Snyder. But for some American writers, this fascination has become a kind of appropriation, a claim to insider knowledge of Asian culture that turns the West into the privileged interpreter of the meanings of the East." And he goes on. It's really worth reading. But so there, on the one hand, there's this resistance to talking about race among white people, Caucasians, and then on the other hand, there's this appropriation of the aesthetics in poetics, as well as in what you noted, music. So my issue was just, who do I invite, and how do I get this discussion going, and how am I going to get other people who are not talking about these issues to listen to the people who are and be interested and motivated. So I wanted to have it here. It's going to be up on Penn Sound. It's going to be on YouTube. I'm going to try to disperse it as widely as possible so that the ideas can be sort of put out there. Without further ado, I would like for Jennifer to sort of talk about the practical issues of talking about this with students, and then.
Well, I have, two kind of personal anecdotes. One that Amy references. I teach within the academy for a living, and I do just try to teach a lot of different types of poets, people who I'm interested in, people who don't match my aesthetics, so my students just get a really broad range. And I also, a little bit of an agenda, I see who is not being taught, and I try to make those people, put those people on my syllabus. And it's pretty easy to figure that out. You just look at what, faculty syllabi, and you bring up names, and you get looks like, huh, who is that? So I do this, and I teach it in pretty majority white, all-white classroom for the most part, which is my first time teaching in that kind of environment. And what happens is when I teach people, poets of color, I find that there's this silence always. And these are classes where students always have something to say. They're really like right in there. And then soon, not always, but soon it seems like there's a pattern that every time I'm bringing in a poet of color, there's this silence. And I've actually, students have come to me afterwards, or I've engaged students and asked like what's going on, and I want to know how do I address this space, because it seems like a great space for potential, like for me to do something and take responsibility there. And I have some students of color who say like, look, I don't want to come and speak for this poet of color and say, oh, this is how you should read it, or it's not my job. And then someone would say, by the way, I hate this poetry, like I don't like that poet, so why should I have that pressure? And then I have some white students who say to me, well, I feel really nervous, like I'm not entitled to have a conversation about this poet's work. So it's like the silence on both sides. There's times where I have addressed the silence on the spot, and it's been somewhat successful, or it's just created more silence. So I'm just kind of positing it as a question. I'm at this point where I don't know. If I can just say one other personal anecdote that was sort of enlightening to me, also involved within the academy. Last spring, I was asked to be on a committee to come up with like great books for the school. That's going to be a core class. So that's another issue in itself why I was asked, and I asked myself that question a lot. But I went to the first couple meetings, and these people were talking and sending emails after the meetings of name dropping. You should read this. You should read that. Not one African American writer was put on the list in the beginning, and I have to admit, I was silent in the beginning because I was like, what is going on? I was totally in shock. I thought, this is the stuff going on when I was in college. And it just, maybe this shows my naivete, but it was meaningful to me. What I did was I went home and I crafted this email through all these emails from the community members saying, where are our writers of color, and where are the African American novelists and poets? I don't see any on the list. Can we address this absence? What's going on? Lo and behold, all the conversation stopped. I was looking at my emails every day going, don't these people have something better to do? That's how many emails I was getting about the topic. And then I said this, and it stopped. And the one person who did respond was the one African American colleague of mine who said, I'm so glad you said something, because I was working up my energy to have that talk with them, and I didn't want to do it. But it was just, it was just a completely enlightening, horrifying experience.
So the catch is, where does somebody white is reading non-white literature or whatever, the poetics, where does the appropriation come in and the silence meet? I'll just pose another really open question that anyone should feel free. I sent this to everybody. Reginald Shepard. Poetry presents the possibility of an otherness that is liberating rather than constricting. It offers the prospect of an alienation from alienation. As I have written too often, minority writers are expected and expect themselves to be spokespeople for whatever a reified version of whatever identity they have claimed or been assigned, and their work is judged almost wholly in those terms. That's from Reginald Shepard's blog post, Against Identity, Poetry for Possibility. So my question is, does poetry truly offer space for people to surpass the limitations of societal, cultural, or sociological labels? What do those kinds of poetries, those with the prospect of an alienation from alienation, both any person, then offer, and what can be worked through in those poetries? Any idea?
Well, I'd like to speak to that a little bit. I mean, Reginald, as most of you know, died 2.5 weeks ago, and he had an obsession with race and the homoerotics of race. So if you read his books, in every book, poem after poem, you literally read the words black and white, right? I mean, it was an obsession. He had this wonderful essay in I think it was 2 issues ago, Conjunctions did a sort of issue on desire. And Reginald's piece in there was all about the intersection of race and self-hatred, and this whole questioning of why he was turned on by white guys. And so for me, race is a germane issue to writing, and as a reader, if race is like a demon, you know, if it's the thing that really keeps them up late at night, then I can see that when I read the writing. But to me, as a reader and a writer, race in and of itself is not very interesting, per se. Because what I'm interested in is what is the obsession of a writer, and then what's the art that translates that obsession. And if it captures my attention, it doesn't matter if I share an identity position with them or not, because I can see an obsession. Now, I live in Washington Heights, so on my street, when I walk out the front door, it's all Russian Jews. When I look out my back window, it's the Dominican community. So every day when I'm walking around, people are walking their dogs. And I often look at their dogs and I think, these dogs like don't know the difference between a Russian Jew and a Dominican or a Chinese American or a white person.
Are you sure?
I think, well, I actually thought about that. Am I sure? And I think visually, of course, they can pick up difference, right? But I think, it seems like to me a dog is more interested in breed, like we're a human breed, and there's a cat and there's another dog, right? I mean, I might be wrong, but seriously, when I go, like we just got 2 cats from the Humane Society in Kingston, and I don't know, but I just get the impression that those cats are not like racist, right? They're just more like going on breed. And so I'm bringing up the story because when I meet someone who says that they're a poet, the part of my tail that starts wagging is like the poet tail. You see, and race is really secondary. It's like if that's their obsession, if they're pissed off because the poetics listserv is not talking enough about race or whatever, I'll listen. I mean, if like that's their issue. But for me, I remember I was on the poetics listserv for like 10 years, and I finally just sort of, I didn't have my name removed, I just sort of died. You know, because I wasn't responding anymore. And so my not participating in that conversation was more like the poetics discussions weren't that engaging to me, even though I like gossip. I think that's why I stayed on for so long. I was just kind of curious what people were bitching about, right? But, so there's so much of it for me that race doesn't enter the picture. And I'll end with a short anecdote, which is, you know, 20 years ago when I started writing poetry and I was seeking out all sorts of people to work with, like Mark Strand, Charles Simic, and Donald Justice was one of my teachers. And he once sat me down and said, Tim, you know, you have so much to write about because you're gay, you're Mormon, and you're Asian. Just like take your pick, you know, and just like run with it. And even at the time when he said that, I thought it was a little bit insulting, right? But at the same point, I also was kind of curious what he's talking about. And one of his former mentees was the poet Marilyn Chin. And so he kind of brought up, do you know Marilyn's work, blah, blah, blah. Now, ultimately for me, in all of my books, I would say my being a Chinese American hardly comes up. You know, maybe like 1 in 300 poems. It's just not my obsession. Whereas being an ex-Mormon missionary and doing missionary position with men has been kind of an obsession. And I would say that it comes up in all of my books, you know, in like one way or another. But I think our obsessions sometimes they choose us, that we don't choose them. So I just want to sort of offer that as a point of view. I mean, race is such an important issue, but for me personally as a reader and a writer, it's not high on my totem pole. Like it does register, and I think about issues of race, but I can also not think about it.
Okay, I have I'll let you know, but I want to respond to that in the sense of, I have Mindy and Tiza's name above this note, because I think that there are aesthetics that are associated with racial groupings. And Barbara Jane Reyes, again, I'm sorry I keep referring to her, but it was just, I read it on the train on the way here and I was like, yes, yes, yes. What is innovative in our communities then? Codes. She gives a catalog of things that are considered innovative, experimental, that I tend to think get absorbed into eventually into the popular poetics or whatever. What is innovative in our communities then? Code switching, translating and fracturing language while writing in polyglot and various vernaculars, integrating performance and music onto the page, presentation, film, and in relation to you, integrating our own culture's oral and poetic forms into written English and Western poetic form. I don't just mean some sort of identity politics that gets referenced. I mean like the techniques that don't necessarily come from a white or Caucasian tradition, that do get absorbed silently and capitalized on. I mean, since we are in a capitalist. She asks, do editors of American publications recognize these innovations? How do these editors read or deal with the foreign elements in this work? She puts foreign in quotes. And especially foreign elements that do not abide by these editors' preconceived notions, assumptions, and prejudices. How do those play out in your own poetics, in the reception of your poetics? Obviously you are probably solicited based on, you have African American poetics somehow, so it does play out even if it's a silent question. I think that's what you were responding to just in the invitation. So whoever, and if Megan, if you want to go ahead, sorry.
Oh no, not at all. Did you guys have something to say about it? Yeah, go ahead. No, that's fine. She posed that question. I'd like you to
cut Megan off.
No, that's cool. That's cool.
Go Megan.
Yeah. Well, I see my take, the reason why I prefer you to follow up on that is that my take is sort of similar to Tim's in the sense that race never really played a major role in my poetics, and so therefore I was going to readdress what Jennifer had sort of started a conversation about, which was how do we sort of break that silence? And I think that sort of falls on, yes, editors, and I think also critics, because we have this select group of people sort of outside of our poetic community at large who decides how our material is presented to those people outside of our community who don't necessarily automatically identify with a certain group of poets or a type of writing. And they may have that thing that Amy's discussing where they recognize certain elements of a poem on a page as being ethnic or being, something other than what they are, but how do they know to identify it as such, and how much of that falls on these editors, critics, and the light that they shed on that? That was sort of my discussion, so I'd rather you sort of follow up.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's a good segue, actually. I'm someone for whom, well, I'll say being black as opposed to race, is a very big part of my tradition, how I come to poetry, how I read poetry, how I read poetry by people who are not black even. And I think for me it's important to say that is and is not race. I mean, part of that is about the situation in this country that gives us shared experiences. Often, racism is the situation that we're talking about, but it's also, my family, is also being born in 1973 and having black arts books in the house, it's going to a black college, learning poetry techniques in black writing communities like Cave Canem and Carolina African American Writers Collective, but also thinking about like all of the poems and poets of those people that I'm reading are reading, which are varied, and that is my route to the obsessions of black poets are not just black poets, So I mean, that's how I get and got to other places. So it's tricky for me because I feel, I read Reginald Shepherd because I read him in a black poetry community, and I'm interested in his non-interest in that community. You know what I mean? Which means that there's an overlap in a lot of these things about like our aesthetics, our politics, our ways of getting at different questions, and all the people I'm interested in his mentors. That's kind of how, which is why I liked hearing Tisa, who is always reading everywhere, and I'm following those threads. So I don't know if I can separate these questions of identity and politics around identity, which is at stake in some of the things I'm interested in reading, and being interested in an obsession, whatever it may be. I think in terms of the earlier question you asked about sort of what is the potential of exploring this issue, I think most people who are exploring an issue are interested in sort of turning around our ways of thinking about any issue, whatever that may be. So I think, yeah, there's a potential of turning around our ideas about race, if that is our interest.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. Being I guess is it true? A generation ahead of you? It's like, I know, really. I think I'll just fold it in. Being of the same generation as Mendy, but just 10 years, more than 10 years prior. Well, no, a little less. I don't know. I think like when words like integration and things like that come up, I kind of freak out. You know, as I was, raised in Boston. I got bussed in Boston, and like all this stuff about like identity and authentic blackness on the one hand, which I thought I was losing when I went through this whole process. Just being a person, so it's been really fraught. And I became a member of the Darkroom Collective in Boston, and I was like the only Bostonian among mostly kind of Southern or Southern identified blacks. And I first learned about Gertrude Stein and Nicole Broussard in the Darkroom Collective. They gave me like this little quiz when I was gonna like join the collective, and I was like totally closeted on on lots of things. I mean, a lesbian, about like what I was reading on the slide, because all of a sudden I needed to kind of show up, as a black writer, or I thought I did, and there were like a bunch of people on all these extension phones. Who are you reading? And I was like following whatever was in like the Boston Globe calendar, like, Jill Eisenstadt and, all of those, lit pack poet writer people that were popular in the 80s. And I was reading what was being reviewed on the one hand, and then making like little like stealth trips to Glad Day bookstore that was upstairs from where I worked, kind of like, going, oh, Rosa Guy, and this and that. And so it was really funny to kind of realize that it was okay to read Tama Janowitz, whose book is behind Mendy over there, and it kind of cracked me up, or to be listening to the Smiths and all this other stuff, and be like this kind of like gothy person.
But I think it's unusual that you're so...
But it's not unusual, because then they were all like, oh, yeah, and I was like, really? You all read this and listen to that too? And they were like, of course. And I was like, oh, shoot, I can just be black now, and not trip. But it's that I started to take that for granted. Right? Because I got very comfortable within a certain social set and expected people to be very sophisticated about their reading. Yes, following obsessions about certain things, about people's obsessions with language. Like we would always kind of parrot Clarence Major, total life is what we want. He would say things like, I don't want to be known as a black poet. I'm not a black writer, I'm a writer who happens to be black. And that whole argument, it's like, okay, how do you live a full life? And what's interesting to me, like with Harriet Mullen in a way, is like where I do readings and where I publish and who shows up. I kind of like struggle, because I do find my world, very much up until recently devoid of black people. Since leaving the Darkroom Collective and moving to California and going to Providence, and now I'm here trying to figure out, am I speaking to everybody like I'm trying to read everybody? Is that what's happening? Or is it something else? So,
I have another question that maybe Matthias and Christopher might have some. I think that what you guys wrote. I guess I'm sort of interested in this. I mean, I think everybody's engaged in this to some extent, everyone up here. Destabilizing the center, as you put it. Well, I'll just read, everyone here received S. Juliet Lee's note to the list. She wanted to be here, of course, but she couldn't. I want to note Jill Maggi wanted to be here, but she couldn't. And everybody contributed something. aesthetics again, the experimental or innovative poetics, and that community. She writes, and my last thought for the moment is that experimental writing in this country has always relied on an encounter with difference as the fuel for its engine, whether via appropriation or staunch rejection or some effort at assimilation. These encounters are productive on many fronts, but also damaging. I'd like us to talk through this acceleration of cascading encounters with difference, and how we as writers can hopefully model a new, if not better, since what seemed to work before has problems, way of making sense of it. This is where my comment before about my inquiry into my ethnic being as in fact a global or universal search for understanding is illustrative, which I think is something you just touched upon. So any ideas from either of you, whoever wants to?
I'll say one line to start. That any person living in the world is steeped in difference. So it's impossible to exist without other something.
And that some people cling to that notion of...
I mean, you break it down to race, and that's a very specific thing, and sex is a very specific thing. It's a very specific, you know, those are specific ideas. I mean, I was thinking about what Tim said earlier. You know, the fact is that you're homosexual, Mormon, and Chinese is what will make people pay closer attention to your work when you're not here. You can write in a contemporary moment and pretend that you're not being couched or framed by your ethnicity, by your sex or race. But after you're dead and your work is there, people are going to dig back into your history if you're lucky enough, read your biography, and imbue your work with more meaning, more readability based on your background. So I think no matter who you are, you're writing from a particular racial, sexual, some kind of social construction that creates a lens through which your work is going to be read and looked at. I mean, for me, I think the real issue, again, and we're getting off, I mean, I think this panel is kind of symbolizes or reenacts the thing that we're not discussing, is that what is whiteness and why is it normative? I mean, we're sitting here having a conversation about everything else except for what is the construction of whiteness and why is it not considered ethnically? Why is it not othered? You know, and I think it's really interesting. Like I stood in for a class at John Jay for Jeffrey Jocks, and we, you know, the kids were. It was an interesting thing. We had a conversation. One kid, white kid, dressed kind of preppy, you know, button down, khakis. A black kid in a hoodie and jeans, and somehow or another, throughout talking about the election and everything, it came down to this kid said that the white kid, who was clearly Catholic, clearly Italian Irish, you know, said, "Oh yeah, the prison system works fine," and he's studying. The class was a English comm class for criminal studies student. He said, "Oh, the prison system works fine. If you don't commit crimes, you don't go to jail." Blah 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 blah. And so the conversation got stoked a little further because somebody said, "Well, if the black kid said, well, if I'm walking down the street and something got stolen, and you're walking down the street and something got stolen, I'm going to get stopped, right? And because of institutional racism, blah blah blah, you are financially better prepared. You know, in addition to having the advantage of being presumed innocent by your whiteness, you also more than likely have more resources to protect yourself if you go to court and I don't, blah blah blah." And that whole conversation kind of, you know, went the way that it went. But I get, and that's a side thing. But I guess for me, the thing that, this is the thing I brought up to them in the class was I said, when you think about othering and you think about the position of blacks and you think about what that means, I want to give you this example. And I said, well, there was a show at the New York Historical Museum, and it was called Without Sanctuary, and it was done by Roy Deprava's daughter. I forget her name. She curated the show, and I said, when you went into that exhibition, you saw the postcards of all of the hanging black people with their testicles cut off and, you know, charred to the bone, and a bunch of white people smiling and, you know, and having barbecues and eating fried chicken around, you know, 3 dead, you know, black male corpses. You know, in the course of that, there's no way to look at that situation at that. And these pictures, most of those pictures were taken between like 1880 and like 1945, roughly. I was like, there's no way you can look at those pictures and say, and say that see that the overwhelming number of the photos were of black people being burnt and hung, and not understand the relationship between that and the situation that black people are in now, and the situation not just socially, but in terms of everyday life, but also the academy, in government. I mean, et cetera, et cetera. But what I pointed out to the white kid is, I said, you need to know that you were once other, and what it means when you actually buy into whiteness. Because in that collection of photographs, there were pictures of hung Italians, first generation Italians, strung up in Florida. There were pictures of strung up Jews. There were pictures of strung up Greek people. And what it means to be white, necessarily, means to buy into whiteness as a property, as a privilege. You give up being Greek, Russian, Italian, Hebrew. You give that up when you come to America so that you can afford the privileges of whiteness. And not to dish you, but I was kind of irritated by what you said, because it's like you're not black, and you're clearly coming to the situation as a clear voluntary immigrant. Voluntary. That's very clear. And what you have done by saying, I'm not going to pay attention to race, I don't have to pay attention to it, it's not a part of my fold, that might be your personality and just who you are, but that is the attitude that reiterates and continuously reaffirms the status quo. It's saying like, well, the status quo is I don't have to pay attention to anything, I'm privileged, and I don't have to deal with it.
Could I put a finer point on that, though? I mean,
well, I know that.
I was addressing writing. I wasn't addressing
right. But that's what we're talking about here, is writing. And we're talking about writing as an instrument of social power. And that's really what this comes down to. Otherwise, it's not really that important. You know what I'm saying? If poetry and writing is not an instrument of social power and betterment of the community, then it's useless.
But let me just complicate the issue, because I don't I remember when I was at St. Mark's Bookshop a couple months ago, and I was flipping through the book that you did with John Keane, right, who I also met years and years ago, and I was interested in that book because of the collaborative process of that book. I was also interested in the fact that you're a visual artist, and yet in this book you're going to be doing the text. Right? And so part of the thing is, when I was reading that book, while I'm aware that both you and John have an African American background, that was not at the forefront of my interest or my reading that text. And I was curious, as I read the text, was race going to be an issue? And at least the parts of it that I read, I felt like I was much more interested in how abstraction and the visual were working as a conversation. Right? So to me, if I approach a text in that manner, I don't think that's making me socially irresponsible. I mean, things come into the foreground and things slide back into the background all the time in our psyches. It's very fluid. I've been working with a Gestalt therapist for the last 3 years, and one of the chief frames of Gestalt therapy is foreground and background. And the idea that if you can move things around back and forth more fluidly, that you get a better picture of what reality is, rather than fixing certain things in the foreground all the time versus fixing certain things.
Let me give you a good example of something.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you and just add on something to what you just said? You said buying into, you said to the kid, the buying into the whiteness. I think that's the problem, is that when you're not part of the dominant group, you are aware of how these, you become aware because you are the target. And that's the problem with whiteness, is that you don't have to buy into it. It's given to you. You just passively accept it. And I think part of my interest in this is, how do we make white people who passively accept this and appropriate from a poetics that is not from their tradition, something they've encountered or experienced. Because I do think there is a connection between experience and innovative poetics.
But what kind of whiteness are we talking about? Like, are we talking about 92nd Street Y whiteness versus St. Mark's Poetry Project whiteness? When I go, I mean, I'm serious.
No, I know.
There are like
there
all
are
these
groups.
great.
You just need to go into
But
the
just think
community
about
and
what
see
you
who's
just
going to
named.
what.
I mean, it's like that is very colored, what you just said. But it's like it's.
We'll open it up to questions in a couple
You know, I
minutes.
mean, in the sense that you could say 92nd Street Y. Well, who lives up there? And who lives on the Lower East Side? The Lower East Side is clearly immigrant culture. For hundreds of years, it's immigrant culture. 92nd Y is something completely different. There's two different kinds of groupings of white people that are dispersed within those two separate groups. But you just gave a blanket statement saying, you know, 92nd Y poet whiteness. Well, yeah, let's name them. What kind of white people are up there? What kind of white people are?
I know, but I'll tell you what. I wasn't even thinking about who reads there or gives workshops at either place. I was thinking about the administration in the last 20 years of both places, which are predominantly run by white people.
Right, two different types of white
So
people
it's
receiving two different kinds of funding based on ostensibly, if you really looked at it, ethnic origin and what time of what century did they get here? What decade did they get here? Who were they? You know, I wanted to address one other thing you said about reading poetry and race, and something that Jennifer said about reading poets. I have a poet friend, I'll even name him because I'm sure if he's here he might even stand up and talk about it, David Mills. I love Hart Crane, right? Hart Crane's one of my favorite poets, know a lot about him, studied his poetry for 20 years, love him. I tried to turn David on to him. David, the first thing he wrote me back after he bought the collected work was, I counted Hart Crane used the word nigger 144 times. That's the first thing he said to me, right? I mean, it wasn't like this guy's brilliant, he's innovative, I don't like his poetry. It's I read nigger in his text 100 and some times. Now, these white kids that won't read black stuff, black poetry, they're afraid, not ignorant, not resistant. They're afraid that they're going to encounter some shit that they got to deal with, and that their parents have to deal with, and that's why they should be reading it.
I have to say something about that, though. One of the reasons why I said I identify with Tim in the sense that race isn't at the forefront of my poetry is that it absolutely isn't. And the reason for that, and maybe I can speak more to that being, you know, half African American as well, but I think that you said something about experience. It's what you grow up with, it's what your family does, it's all of these things make up race and culture. And I was raised in these schools where I wasn't taught African American literature. I was one of those people where I had to seek it out on my own. And so I don't know if it's so much the students being afraid to encounter it as it's just not presented. And it gets into that thing that Jennifer was saying. How do we get it to a point where it's handed to people, it's there, and they can make that decision for themselves, whether they want to continue to be ignorant or whether they want to delve into a culture that they're not presented with or they're not used to.
I mean, that's the crux of the problem, though, is that it's not about when as a black person of, you know, just as a black person studying in school, when someone sits, you know, an Elliot down in front of you who was a racist fucker, when you set down, you know, Pound or fucking Poe, who is fucking pro-slavery, and depending on who the white people pick to bring into the university per decade, right? And what I'm saying is that, you know, ultimately that shouldn't be on the table, because you don't have an American literature when there are not black people writing. You just don't have it. I mean, the first American novel was in the fucking 19th century, and Negroes was writing then. I mean, you know, Phyllis Wheatley wrote before then. There's no way that you can have a conversation about American literature and not include black people in it as a canon. It doesn't exist.
But and along with that, though, not just black people, but also all of the other cultures.
All of the other cultures.
That's kind of what I'm trying to get at. We have so many here.
I know. I understand that. I understand that. But what I'm saying is, fundamentally, if we have an American culture, it shouldn't be one thing.
I agree.
Can I bring it back to a catch? Because I'm going to bring Matthias in, actually. It's true. I ask my college classes all the time, have you ever read Zora Neale Hurston? Amy Tan. They don't even know who Amy Tan is. She's got an opera coming out. You know, they've never heard of Toni Morrison. Literally, I'll teach on Long Island. It happens every class. Maybe one African American student has. But it's a hand-in-hand thing. The students who are they become teachers who teach the same. But there is, back to the aesthetics or the innovation aspect of it, someone is reading this, someone of any kind of particular whiteness, there are people who are reading these poetries, these literatures, and they are, I mean, it's the Elvis phenomenon. You know, Elvis went to the juke joints and got his music, and suddenly he's heralded as the next great thing. He's used these techniques that he's taken from a culture that he has only just been exposed to, and I mean, the unfairness is just palpable, but I guess back to how do we destabilize this whiteness, Matthias? I'm putting it all on you now, as the white man.
See what I mean? It's 7 of you. That's, yeah.
Speak to the status quo.
And just one add-on, do your poetics. Do you attempt to acknowledge and destabilize? I mean, is it...
Back off a little bit there, I think that the process of teaching literature, the process of reading representations from different versions of American culture are always habits of reading and habits of definition. And definition to me is a fundamental work of illogic. So the easiest definition is the one that's the most reserved, that's in opposition to the most things. And I think, yeah, the process of just not having non-white poetry in front of poets or readers is one that defines poetry in this way. As far as the process of destabilizing, part of it is just recognition. Coming from a white perspective, it would be, it is easy to write poems in which race has no bearing. And that's obviously because race has a fundamental bearing that I can ignore. So to me, being straight, white, middle class white male, yeah, I'm everything. Everything awesome.
That's the title of this panel.
It's a matter of recognizing the myth of the center, and recognizing the myth of the norm, and placing oneself in a matrix in which it is assumed that I am also a participant in difference, and that I'm not the perspective that acknowledges and judges and attempts to read the symbolism of difference, but that, like Levinas says, you're looking, or like Chris said, the eye-to-eye contact with difference, so that they are staring back at all times. So for me, it is a process of deciding, like, yeah, I'm going to write about whiteness, which sounds like the lamest thing to write about. Although I guess there's kind of a hip theory side of things in white theory now as well. But yeah, I mean, it is a part of my poetics, but it's also a decision I have to make as a writer.
I'm going to ask a question, but Tiza's going to speak next. How do you get other white dudes to do it? Tiza has a response.
Oh, yeah, I was just, when you said, like, whiteness theory, I was just going to comment on that. Like, I remember many years ago reading David Ignatieff and actually Toni Morrison, too. At one point was publicly proposing, like, whiteness studies in universities and, to kind of get into, what does it mean to be white? What is whiteness? Was that book, How the Irish Became White? And just kind of like, because I remind my students too, like, hey, I pull it right up on the internet and pull down the screen and put it on the projector and show the big sign that says, no blacks, no Jews, no Irish, no dogs, on establishments in the South. And they'll go, and it's just like, yeah, this whole thing about difference and, this idea of, like, white theory or whiteness studies is really supposed to try to dig into, what is this phenomena, how do white people see themselves in the world? What is it? Is there such a thing as a white aesthetic? what is a white subject position in literature, you know, because there are all these other like kind of lit crit for people of color. What does that look like when you're looking through a racialized lens at, you know, literature written by white people, if white critics are doing that work? What's that process going to be like? We haven't quite gotten there yet at all. And there was like this kind of like trendy hip moment where people were having white trash parties. You know, it just seemed to kind of devolve into like, you know, mayonnaise and Wonder Bread and, you know, soup dip. And the class thing and class pride and rockabilly and kind of like suddenly this kind of, you know, reifying and reascription of white power as this point of pride instead of kind of looking at, well, wait a minute. And the class piece that kind of came into it was really bizarre too, because then like the whole project seemed to fall apart in a way. Like I'm not quite sure like where whiteness studies and white theory is actually at, and who's involved. But I, you know, since being invited to this panel, I was just like really like checking like, okay, you know, that was like 1995 when I first heard about that, and like what's going on right now, and how does that, for all the intellectuals that I've been around in experimental community, doesn't kind of register, like who's doing the work. And so like the only piece I've ever read that is kind of like a sustained self-reflexive exploration is The Transformations by Juliana Spar. And I'm sure there are other books, so, or other things, just to keep it within this kind of idea of experimental poetry community, and what that means to someone's subject position, and what is that supposed to look like or sound like, right? Like we have already this preconceived notions of what it's supposed to look and sound like from people of color, but then I'm listening and questioning like, okay, do I know? Am I able to kind of understand what that looks and sounds like when I'm listening to a white poet, or am I automatically kind of like it can't exist? So, yeah.
I was also going to say that I think the kind of disappointing thing is that sometimes you put that kind of, this is what you used to be, white people on the board, and people will say, oh, that's horrible. Good thing we don't have to do that now. You know what I mean? And the same might be also true of our black students, you know. And so the question of how do you get people to address it? I mean, one of the other scary things is that with whiteness studies or white people interrogating race, I mean, while I find that useful, I don't know that that necessarily is going to change the fact that white people are more likely to be read when they're doing that by white audiences. That doesn't necessarily change the balance of the sort of the racial racist politics that govern how we move as writers. While it may change our consciousness as individual writers, you know, or even small communities, it doesn't necessarily make the balance of things change. And I don't know. I mean, that's the kind of thing that makes me quote Ollie Wilson saying, you know, what do you have to say to people who don't read you in the ways you want to read nothing? You know what I mean? Yeah.
Is this a valid question for anyone? Is it possible to sort of expose the dysfunctionality of whiteness in any way? I mean, it is a dysfunctional.
Comedians have been doing it for, you know, it's not like we don't know.
I guess in poetics, and is anyone doing it in their poetics? Anybody?
Clay Neshelman is one of those people that really has a problem with being a wasp from the Midwest. I mean, he's an old guy now, but all of his poetry written in his 30s, 40s, 50s, he's constantly like interrogating what it means to be middle class, white, wasp. Hart Crane, the same thing, like in a more elaborate art, you know, more artistically. I mean, he's the same. That's one of the things I like about those two in particular, that they definitely dealt with it and done it. You know.
There's a lot of debate about Tony Logan. You know,
yeah, for lots of reasons.
I'm going to open it up just because we're running out of time to questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask the panel?
I kind of have like an observation and a comment. I think because in the United States, in literary circles, it's mostly rich white males that pull the strings, and because they have the economic muscle, you know, their clubhouse of editors, critics, you know, I would tend to believe would generally be of the same mindset. And to kind of highlight what I believe is racism in poetry and the literary world, for instance, you had two black female poets, Wendelin Brooks and Lucille Clifton. Gwen Brooks was the first black woman to receive a Pulitzer Prize in poetry, and Lucille Clifton was the second, probably the second black person, 50 years later. And probably within that half century, no other poet of color, to my knowledge, maybe the people in the panel can correct me if I'm wrong, received, you know, any of these major prizes. And I think, you know, that's part of the whole, you know, whiteness or white mindset when it comes to, you know, the poetic, the artistic world.
Well, I think Lucille Clifton didn't win the Pulitzer. She won a National Book Award, and Rita Dove and Yusef Komiaka did. I mean, just to, you know, put the facts down.
Oh, it's reading up for me.
Yeah.
Does anyone have a question, another question? Oh yeah.
My other question. But still, didn't Rita receive her prize about 50 years after Wendelin Brooks was the first one to get it? Wasn't it a very extensive time period?
Yes.
And I think, you know, even when, I mean, Natasha Trethewey just won the Pulitzer, and I went into a bookstore looking for her book and couldn't find it. You know what I mean? So, I mean, the fact that she won this prize that very few people of color have won didn't make her more visible in some places where you would expect, you know, where you would expect to find her, and I think race has everything to do with that.
But you know, this raises up an issue for me, which is you think about the experimental writing community, it's definitely not getting these prizes at all. So, I mean, I think that's also worth pointing out. I mean, this panel discussion was on the whiteness, you know, and racism in the experimental writing community, and I just thought, wow, I mean, the poor experimental writing community, the white people aren't doing so good either. I mean, you know, so it just seems kind of ironic to me.
Wasn't one of the comments that somebody made actually about like, you know, white people weren't that comfortable in experimental writing community? Dana Lomax, right? So she wouldn't be surprised. Like black people were all.
We have a question.
I'm
Sorry.
just curious though, are those prizes the primary goals? Isn't there something wrong with the fact that the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, that very particular ways of getting one's work into the world, and it's about distribution and who has access to the work, but that kind of limited set of targets, that it in certain ways homogenizes the kind of work that can be produced and sort of enters the world.
That was exactly my point when I brought up, you know, the critics in my original discussion, is that, you know, every single one of us, I don't know about you guys, but I don't write for each other. We all love poetry. I write for other people. I write for these people. I want them to sort of understand these common themes in humanity, and I write for other people outside of the poetic community. And I want them to get involved in these themes. But we're limited by how our work is presented, and we don't have control over how it's presented to the outside world.
I mean, I think of Ishmael Reed, I mean, we could go through a whole list of writers who decided at some point that going to the standard set of publishing houses, going through the sort of status quo venues for getting work into the world, meant for them that they would have to produce different kinds of work. And so they said no, and they didn't make millions, but they can